Good day to you. Today is November 13th, and which is relevant, of course, because of the fast-moving world we're living in, to know when I recorded this. I do have a topic today. But before I get to my topic, I would like to say a few framing things up front. The first one has to do with anti-Semitism. As we know, anti-Semitism is rife at the moment, but I think it's useful to point out that those who study these things point out that the uptick in anti-Semitism in the US really came when Trump came into power. And you remember the swastika demonstrations in, was it Charleston? And a kind of support for extreme right-wing and to some extent extreme left-wing groups who were anti-this and anti-that, including anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitic attacks picked up in the United States. Now, of course, based on what's currently going on, anti-Semitism in the US seems to be somewhat out of control and exaggerated precisely because on university campuses and so forth, there are demonstrations. I should add that it's not just anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia. And the problem with discussing what's going on in the Middle East right now is that almost anything one says, one gets accused of either making an anti-Semitic comment if one criticizes Israel, or an Islamophobic comment if one focuses in on the Arab side of the equation. This is very unfortunate because it makes it very difficult to have a rational discussion of not only where we are, but where we need to go. Obviously, right-wing extremist groups in the United States fan the flames on the internet and on the media. And I think it's really important for leaders in the U.S. to speak up against all of these things and to try to separate this sort of anti-Semitism that's been afoot for a long time and its exaggeration on the extreme political scene in the United States with those who wish to seriously criticize aspects of the Israeli government and its actions. Now, for those of you who look at the Middle East before these current sets of crises, you know that Israel had a right-wing government, Netanyahu, with extreme right-wing individuals. In this way, in some ways, he echoed the Trump administration. And he was very busy trying to change the internal politics of Israel before all these events took place. Some people in his cabinet were out and out racist and Islamophobic racist. One or two ministers even claimed that the Palestinians on the West Bank should be shot and encouraged that. So that the politics inside of Israel, which we now forget about because of the crisis, was very dire, and a large proportion of the Israeli population really opposed the Netanyahu government. As you will recall, there were serious demonstrations and so forth. Now, of course, because of the attack against Israel, Israelis have to unite in support of whatever the government has, even though they may not support it in its domestic and even some foreign policy areas. And that's perfectly understandable. It's also understandable that the United States, the most powerful and closest ally of Israel, would have a president who is a strong supporter of the state of Israel and its well-being and should have enunciated that. However, you might have noticed that in recent comments, the Biden administration, both Biden and Secretary of State, have had to step back a little bit in saying that what happened to Israel is atrocious, etc., and at the same time, somewhat on the margins, criticizing current Israeli policy in Gaza and in the West Bank. And if one wants to find a solution to the crisis of Israel and the Palestinians, and I might say repeated crises, one really has to look more at the nuances of what Israeli policies and what Arab policies and what Hamas policies are, and how these things can be changed and moderated, so that at the end of the day, whether there's a two-state solution or some other solution, some kind of sense can be made out of that. And what's too bad about domestic American politics right now is that as soon as somebody says, well, one needs to rethink about how to move forward a little bit, it is, of course, very easy for people who are riled up, and riled up for perfectly good reason, given what happened in Israel, to say this is anti-Semitism, and it's not necessarily anti-Semitism. So I would urge people to become more nuanced and sophisticated. Criticism of Israeli politics is not the same as anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism very often doesn't even include any understanding or concern about internal Israeli politics or Middle East politics. Many of the people that are demonstrating now on both sides, Islamophobia and the anti-Semitism side, do not have a particularly well-informed or nuanced knowledge as to how the things that are happening now came to happen, or how to get out of them, and how to fix and find some kind of long-term solution. So that's by way of preface. Now, in terms of the expansion of Israel dealing with the horrors of its what happened to Israel, which I think any reasonable person considers totally horrific, and without any attention to the norms of the behavior of a government or even opposition outside of Israel, one is beginning to see a more nuanced discussion even inside of Israel, and the beginnings of a criticism of the Netanyahu administration. And I think Americans need to be very careful to at least pay attention to the internal discussions in Israel, which are beginning to be more critical, not of the outrage of what happened in Israel, but the particular policies of the Netanyahu government and some of its ministers. Almost everybody expects that the Netanyahu government will fall as soon as the sort of major crisis about these current events are over. And I think many Israelis will be willing to support a government which is not a right-wing extremist government, which is what the Netanyahu government is right now. Okay, having said that, we're all inundated with the horrors of what's happening in Gaza. And not surprisingly, whether one thinks Israel is justified in harsh response to what happened to it, what's happening to the folks in Gaza also we need to pay some attention. And here I'd like to back off for a second and say that the idea that Gaza was sort of an independent enclave was to begin with wrong. That is to say, Israel was very controlling. I mean, there was Gaza and they could run themselves in many ways, but the borders were controlled, the land borders, the sea borders. Israel kept very tight control of what could go in and out and so forth. So that when the Netanyahu government right now says that when, the fighting is over, Israel is going to stay in control, Gazans can be forgiven by saying, well, they were in control more or less before. Maybe they're advertising more control. And it's also understandable that the international community is now saying, we can't just repeat this over and over again. Some kind of longer-term solution needs to be found, A, for Israel to be safe and flourish, and B, for the Gazans, not just the Gazans, but the Palestinians, to have some solution so they have some control over their lives. The question, of course, is why did the Hamas do what it did when it did? And as you probably know, most analysts say that had a lot to do with the negotiation between that the U.S. was in the middle of between Israel and Saudi Arabia to make peace in some fashion and recognition. And that, of course, brought in the Iranians, which are supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and its surrogates in the Middle East, so that it has the whole Israeli Gazan situation and Palestinian situation has a larger playing field, which includes control of various aspects of the Middle East, of which Iran is part of it, and so forth. And I don't want to belabor that point today, but to say that this is much more complicated than the rhetoric that we hear here in the demonstrations, and that some of which the Israeli government is putting out right now. So over the years, one of the odd things, or maybe not odd, but less noted things, is that the United Nations and international institutions have tried to play a role, and tried to play a role through its various agencies. And for example, the World Health Organization, for example, every imaginable, UNESCO, UNICEF, all these UN institutions have spent much money, much personnel, and have, in a sense, made life in Gaza semi-livable over the years. And so the UN has been involved not only politically through the Security Council and the General Assembly, but has been involved in trying to sustain Gaza and life in Gaza, and in some ways pouring in tons of money and tons of personnel and training tons of Gazans to somehow make life livable in that enclave. Before I leave the UN for a moment, let me also say that when the attack on Israel happened, and then the response of Israel, the Secretary General Gutierrez spoke up and said that, a plague on both your houses, but that the situation needs to be seen in a larger context. What he, of course, meant is that this is a larger problem than just the temporary conflict between these two states. It has a historical past. It has the resolutions for the Palestinians have to include the West Bank and so forth. He was roundly criticized, and immediately the ambassador of Israel to the United Nations said the Secretary General ought to resign because of what he said. What he said was perfectly sensible, and he went on the air the next day and repeated it, and he has continued to repeat it. For those of you who would like to hear what he has to say about it all, the Sunday program on CNN interviewed him, and it's worth hearing, what he said on CNN, which is perfectly reasonable for a Secretary General, right? Trying to bring the parties together and also trying to say this is a complicated thing with historical basis. We need to look at the overall. So during the depth of this conflict now, and I don't need to rehearse for you, Gaza has a couple of million people, 2.3 million people, of which somewhere between 30 and 40% are children, of which 1 million people were told to leave northern Gaza, go to southern Gaza, even though the roads to southern Gaza were not safe to travel by and large. Vehicles weren't available, gasoline wasn't available. Essentially, all of Gaza now is, one state of total disarray and suffering. There is no electricity, there's no water, there's no livelihood. People are camped out everywhere, and so forth. You also know the dire situation in the hospitals, where people are dying now because they are being attacked by Israel, because Israel says that Hamas has tunnels underneath the hospitals, which may exist or may not exist. But whatever, of the patients, the thousands of patients in those hospitals injured through the bombing and so forth, has, become obvious to all of us. Now, that raises questions, or that reignites the point I'm trying to make, is that most of these hospitals, in fact, are run by international institutions, non-governmental and non-governmental, which I'll talk about in a minute. And, it may very well be that Hamas has taken advantage of those places, but most of the hospitals in Gaza are already closed because they've been bombed, they've been, couldn't operate anymore. And the few hospitals that still exist are now under attack, right? So what that means is not just that the World Health Organization and its doctors are now under attack in Gaza, but the non-governmental organizations are also under attack. And the non-governmental organizations are everywhere to be found in Gaza. That is to say, large organizations like Doctors Without Borders. There are organizations that are international, that is to say, they belong to multiple countries, and they have been busy, trying to support the population all over the years. And now, and over the years, have also trained quite a few Gazans to run these health facilities and these schools. And so when they are attacked and when they're killed, you're not only killing international servants of non-governmental organizations and intergovernmental organizations, but you're also killing the Gazans, which are now equipped to look after the patients and so on. I think over 20 Gazan doctors have been killed so far, not to mention nurses and so on. So that the whole medical establishment, which was supported not by Israel, but rather was supported by the World Health Organizations and non-governmental organizations of one kind or another, are now in total disarray, and their heroic servants, doctors and nurses, are under threat and working under horrible conditions. A lot of the some of the organizations that have been named to you in the media, for example, the International Red Cross, right? The International Red Cross playing a very major role. The International Doctor Organization, the medical arm of various Red Crosses, Red Crescent, which is the Arabic arm of the Red Cross, and so forth. They're all being busy trying to save lives. And of course, as you know, by now 11, 12,000 civilians have lost their lives. And a lot of the international servants are under attack and have lost their lives. And on it goes. And of course, Israel is justifying itself by saying Hamas needs to be rooted out. There are sort of some stray comments I want to make now, and that is the idea that if they the Israelis kill all the Hamas leadership in Gaza and get rid of the tunnels and so forth, which seems, they can justify it on the basis of what happened in Israel, Hamas will not go away. Hamas is in, various places in the Middle East. Much Hamas leadership is in fact outside of Gaza right now. They can easily, over the time, reconstitute itself. That's because the problems are not going away. And as you've probably heard in the news, there's Hamas leadership in Qatar, right? Qatar, by the way, is serving as a negotiator in this mess. And Qatar is, in a sense, an ally of the United States as well. We have a huge military base in Qatar that we don't want to give up. And so the situation can't really be covered in the half an hour that I'm speaking to you because it is enormously complex. And in order to resolve any of it, the complexity has to be known and has to be dealt with. And it's not enough to say, well, I'm on the side of Gaza or the Hamas, and I'm on the side of Israel, and to worry about the anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, which should be worried about and should be dealt with in every imaginable way. But to put the genie back in the bottle in this particular case will be enormously complicated and enormously difficult and may take years. And how to work out the Palestinian issue with the help of international institutions, with the help of non-governmental institutions who are absolutely essential in the survivability of the humans that are still in Gaza, is a major and a long-term assignment. And it seems to me everybody is agreed that as soon as the worst of this is over, that is to say, Israel manages to get rid of some of the leadership in Gaza and destroy the tunnels, and maybe another 10,000 Gazans will lose their lives. What you have in Gaza is a destroyed place. There are no places for people to live. There you have no water system, you have no electricity, and you have people who will not be able to put their lives back together again, which is a recipe for the next radicalization of the next generation. So something needs to be done to not produce that. And what that something is by no means clear to anybody. People are making suggestions, but as soon as there's a suggestion, the current Israeli government shoots it down. What most people think, and I tend to agree with, is that as soon as the worst of this is over, that is to say, the bombing of Gaza is over, the reckoning will have to come inside of Israel. That is to say, the Netanyahu government will go away, and presumptively a more reasonable government that is not a right-wing government will come into power and will figure out how, on the one hand, to put the genie back in the bottle inside Israel and develop some sort of sensible norms again, political norms inside of Israel, and to be willing to pay attention to international mediators to try to figure out where to go from here. And where to go from here has to include the West Bank, where, by the way, the current government of Netanyahu is encouraging settlers not only to expand, but to shoot Palestinians. A few hundred Palestinians have been shot in the West Bank, as well as the Israeli military and police are also shooting Palestinians. I'm not saying some settlers aren't losing their lives, but the attack essentially is to have a kind of a mini version of what's going on in Gaza, going on the West Bank. Well, some Israeli government, with the help of international institutions, with the help of major powers like the EU, like the United States, major powers in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt perhaps, will have to sit down and figure out a process in conjunction with the Israeli government as to where to move and how to move forward. It is going to be enormously complex, but in the interim of that happening, something needs to be happening in Gaza again. And to the extent to which non-governmental organizations are going to be crying for funding because the funding is not coming from Israel. The funding is coming from you and me for non-governmental organizations, and is coming from the intergovernmental organizations, obviously from the agencies that are supported by their governments. So the World Health Organization, for example, and UNRWA, which is the relief organization for Gaza and so forth, will require enormous amounts, billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, not to just figure out what to do in the future, but what to do with the remaining Gazans. For example, let's say more Gazans get killed, but let's say it's still 2 million Gazans, and how to construct a society that humans can continue to live in Gaza. Now, I want to make one other point, and that, of course, is that there's a discussion always about let the Palestinians leave Gaza and move to Egypt or move to the Sinai Peninsula and so forth. And there I must say that Palestinians are not popular in the Middle East for a variety of historical and contemporary reasons that we can't go into today. But for example, Jordan, right, which is right next door, which has had a peaceful relationship over some time with the Israeli government. A very large chunk of the Jordanian population are in fact of Palestinian origin. They have been taken in. And as a matter of fact, the Queen of Jordan has Palestinian background. And they're Palestinians living in various parts of the Middle East. Can all the Palestinians be absorbed in other Middle East countries? I doubt that that is politically feasible. But it is the case that argument will be made, and some of the NGOs, non-government organizations, and maybe even some arms of the UN and other regional organizations will argue that some of these people in Gaza who are homeless, who may be badly injured and so forth, ought to be incorporated in other states. And first of all, as I pointed out, other states by and large wouldn't want them, but even if some other states are willing to take some of them, and some of the badly injured can be moved to hospitals outside of Gaza, for example, it will require huge commitments on the part of non-governmental organizations as well as some arms of the United Nations to fund this. So this is not just an Israeli Gaza problem or a Islamophobia, problem, or any other kind of problem. This is a problem that it's for the world in a way, for the Middle East. And it very easily, this conflict, as you know from listening to the news, can spread in the Middle East, and everybody is trying to avoid that at the moment. But it goes to show that when you have a crisis like this, it becomes an international crisis, not just a political international crisis, but a crisis of international institutions and a crisis of non-governmental institutions. There is a whole body of international law which was developed after the Second World War, which deals with what you can and cannot do in war, and what you can and cannot do in terms of humanitarian aspects. Without boring you with a litany about all of this, let me just say that obviously the Hamas broke international laws when it attacked Israel, but Israel is now also violating international law right and left. And Israel's response, or Netanyahu's response, was, well, the United States, look what they did at the end of World War II in Japan, and bombing the hell out of Dresden at the end, and that was all civilian attacks. And I would just remind us all that that happened. And yes, we did do this, but that's what generated the post-World War II international law, which tried to deal with both what governments can and cannot do in wartime, and the rights of civilians and the laws of war. And those are currently being violated by Israel, by saying, well, others have done it, we can do it too. So when this all settles down a bit, there has to be a kind of a new discussion about what happens when a country violates, or in this case, two countries, Hamas anyway, one movement and Israel, what happens when they both violate the norms and the standards, which are not always adhered to in international law, but which are the goal and sometimes deter people from acting. In general, I think, and let me end on this note, when you defend yourself against an attack, one of the things that international law says is that your response has to be proportional. And the problem right now is that it's generally speaking clear to certainly many people in the international realm, other governments, even the United States right now, that the Israeli needed to respond against its attack, but its response is not proportional. Its response is a violation of almost every aspect of international law. And so a whole new discussion needs to arise of what to do and what happens in a circumstance like this, where there's massive violation on both parties' side of what are the understandings of international law. And it does not help to say, oh, well, the United States did this and that. At the end of World War II, the United States did this and that in Iraq and Afghanistan, because we all know that insofar as the U.S. violated the norms of humanitarian and international law, has been radically criticized. And so it's not inappropriate down the road to also criticize what's going on in the Middle East in terms of the role that international law should play. To what extent can parties be found guilty? To what extent does the International Criminal Law Court work at all? It doesn't work very well. It's a topic for another discussion. But there is a reckoning that's going to be down the road, and that reckoning in some ways has to await some kind of cessation of the level of conflict that we're seeing right now. Thank you very much. See you in 2 weeks.